welcome to another version, I should say, because this is not just another episode or another installment. I actually want to use the word version because we're going a bit off target and then coming back on. So welcome to another version of Risk Unfiltered. I'm Ken Hackshaw. I'm pleased and privileged to have with us Dr. Atiba David Griffith. This is the second time we're meeting with Atiba. In the first instance, it was prior to him working on this massive thesis and getting his doctorate. And we were trying to get him since he finished that work. And so we are happy to have him. We'll be talking a lot about that, the thesis, the theory, the work behind his doctorate, and how we could marry that with our education system across the Caribbean, or the profession in risk management, the profession of data analytics. So all of that and a bit more. Welcome, Dr. Atiba Griffith.
Thank you, sir. Glad to be here.
Good to have you again. So I think the last time we met were a couple months ago. You were working on your doctorate at that point in time. I had a bit of an insight, a little bit on what you were working on based on our conversation, but having gotten a peek at the end product, or the almost to end product, it's truly fascinating, both from an educational standpoint, from a data analytics deep dive perspective, and of course, the space we operated in is risk management, and this is Risk Unfiltered. So, Atiba, tell us, what have you been up to since our last conversation many months ago? And let's get right into it.
Yes. So again, glad to be here. Last couple of months, of course, taking the decision to complete a doctorate in education, which is Doctor of Education degree. Of course, I was busy writing up the dissertation. A matter of fact, the dissertation was technically due in November, going into December, but got a burst of energy, and I wanted to finish it before crop over. So we actually finished it back in April, and that went off to the editor. Came back in early May, and then we did a requirement was to do what we call a defense viva voce. So you defend your research. So that was done on June 23rd. 2 days before my birthday, so I don't have to tell you how that celebration went. But on a more serious note, the research is very applicable. I did not want to write something that would be put on a shelf,
right?
To catch dust. I decided to write something that I can hand to anyone. The way it's written is written in very plain, mundane English. Even the statistics, how it's written. I can hand it to any policymaker or any individual interested in education, whether that is in the Caribbean or abroad, right? Mm-hmm. The theories and conclusions and findings are still applicable, generalizable across different age groups. So yes, that's what I'll be up to mostly. And then also trying to get back into a rhythm, because once you remove something that is taking up a lot of your time, you have to get back into the rhythm. So that is pretty much what I'm doing now. But again, it's very interesting. It actually cuts across fields. It cuts across sociology. It cuts across risks, actually, in terms of matriculation risks and social and economic risks by extension.
What I would like for you to do, though, is before you start, give a behind the scenes. What actually, you mentioned it a bit earlier, but yeah. What really drove you to this product? What was the driving force? Now, I know you have a little bias on the math side, and yeah. I will always lean there. You may disagree, but is it as simple as, it had to be about, well, I'll let you tell the story. And why don't you name the theory, and I wouldn't call it a hypothesis, but because it went more further than that.
My background is varied in terms of academic background, mm-hmm. and also in life in general. What I recognize for sure, some people disagree, But what I recognize is that there's certain foundations that you can build on. And one of those main foundations is mathematics. Mathematics cuts across all fields, regardless of what you do. And it's very interesting that is such a foundational subject, but still a lot of people are pretty much scared, literally scared of the subject. You know, they run from the subject, literally. I do have a bias, of course. I was a mathematics lecturer at the University of West Indies. I've always worked in field of mathematics and statistics. But what a lot of people do not know is that I actually have a degree in music performance. So a lot of times I get the question, how did you change from music to mathematics and economics and engineering? But it didn't change. It was just a transition that happened. What I found is that once you understand the basics of mathematics, you can transition very easily in most cases across subject lines, across career lines. And it so happened that when I was doing my first engineering degree, which was I only did a master's degree in engineering. I didn't start at the bachelor's level in engineering. When I did my electrical engineering master's degree, a pretty rough school, New York University. When I got the interview, because of the fact that I did not have a first degree in engineering, I had a master's in economics, computational economics, but still that was not the requirement to get into the program. So I had to do an interview with the selection committee. And what confirmed certain things to me was that the head of the program, in terms of admissions, he's also a professor of electrical engineering. He said that he was not good enough to go to music school, so his parents made him do electrical engineering. And that rang a bell. And what it did, it triggered something. It triggered something in me to say, but how are you not good enough in music? So your parents made you do electrical engineering. And what I got to find out in terms of doing my research is that when you start in the arts, especially music performance, especially, you're absolutely brilliant in mathematics in most cases. It's just that you never had to practice it, right? And from that time, I was trying to prove that point going forward, that once you have a certain foundation, I can give you any subject line, especially mathematics, and you'll be fine. I'm not saying it's not going to be challenging. You're going to have to study and do the work, but the way you process information make it absolutely easier than the average person who didn't have certain exposure.
Are you saying there's a direct correlation between someone good at mathematics and potentially good at music?
The other way around. So
if
you will
good
find
at music, you'll be good at mathematics.
In most cases, yeah.
In most cases,
yeah.
Okay.
And the studies that have that come to the same conclusion. Sometimes you see that's why they say for a child, especially in primitive years like 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, you introduce them to things like dance, gymnastics, music, things that require rhythm, things that require thinking, and things that also require you to read another language. And music is one of those things that require you to read a different language completely.
Correct.
Right. So it actually opens up your ability to understand language very well, your language, and it also opens up the ability for you to understand reasoning and what we call abstract information. Because remember, sound, you can't touch it. You can feel the vibrations,
right?
But you can't touch it. So it's very abstract in nature. So you actually understand abstract information already. It's just that you never formulated it in mathematics. So when I got the chance to write on the dissertation, I was gonna actually write something that was very extremely mathematical, and then I changed my mind. I said, you know what? Let me go into the more gray areas, which is sociology, education theory, learning theory, behavioral theories, and then try to link that back, use the statistics to justify what I wanted to do. And that, what I pretty much wanted to do with this research is to have at some point a policy review, the way we have our education structure. In terms of processes, how we go about teaching, the teaching and learning methods, especially for mathematics. So going down the line of that, I developed a working theory, which forms a conceptual framework It's called System Hybridism Learning Theory. It integrates the different elements of learning theories along with what we call educational policy and student experience. So as I go through the presentation, when I start, you actually see those elements and themes coming through very strongly. But also behind that, I had to put in the mathematics also. So I actually did the statistical justification of why we should change the policies in terms of education.
But the policy itself, and I know you'll do a demo. So maybe let's jump into that.
As mentioned, this is actually not the full title of the research, but because of the nature of this presentation, since we're dealing with risk also, I coined this presentation reducing the social, economic, and matriculation risks. The advantage of taking CCSLC finance examination before the CSEC. This is a risk academy, Caribbean Risk Academy, risk management academy. So of course I leaned it towards bringing out the risk of not doing certain things. The CSEC examination is the Caribbean examination, secondary examination certificate, which is a more advanced examination. The CCSLC is a Caribbean certificate of secondary level competence. So it's really a competence and literacy examination.
Oh, okay.
Which you can take before the CSEC examination. At this point, if you choose to, it's not mandatory.
Okay, and you don't have to take one before. You don't necessarily have to take one before the other. Or
no.
Nothing like that. Okay.
No, it's not mandatory. So that's a policy gap there. It's not required by ministries. And of course, when we speak of the Caribbean, we're speaking of the participating territories that take Caribbean Examination Council examinations. Right. So there's just some important notes before we actually get into the full presentation. So there's 6 points. First is the problem statement. So the problem that we were investigating, or the problem that we were trying to highlight, is the males underperform on the CSEC examination. And that's something known across the board. It's been published, it's been published in annual reports, subject reports. You can see that they're underperforming, right? So that creates what we call a matriculation risk. So matriculation is your ability to be enrolled in a program meeting the requisites or the prerequisites that are required. So if you do not have CSEC mathematics, you're limited at what you can do in terms of going through the educational system. It creates what we call a matriculation risk. So you run the risk of not being matriculated. Then with that, there's a paucity, that what we call like a slowdown in the enrollment of post-secondary programs, right? And that creates what we call a less competitive global citizen. In this case, I highlighted the male cohort, right? So it creates what we call a less competitive male Caribbean citizen. So that creates what we also call a social and economic risk, because now you have someone that cannot necessarily provide at a certain level due to the lack of their ability to matriculate. There's a twist to that story also, because some will say that you don't need that to have a certain vocation, right? But we're going on the assumption that having it is better than not having it. So that's one of the assumptions there, right? So for the purposes of this research, we focus on the 14 to 90-year-old groups cohort. The reason for that is that is usually where you will take the CCSLC, which will lead you into the CSEC. So around 13 to 14, that's where you're preparing for the CCSLC. And by 15, you're writing the CSEC examination. Now, so the sample, of course, is for the Caribbean territories that participated in the CSEC examinations. For comparative purposes, to draw out the point, we compared what we call the group that took CCSLC before CSEC and the group that only took CSEC. So you can see if there's a statistical significant difference in the mean scores. Now, to bring it full circle, we actually compared it, those who took the CCSLC examination with the female cohort that took the CCSLC examination, and that was to show that there's no gender differences in terms of the scoring, in terms of the averages. Okay. Right? It is a little sticky in terms of how it's worded, but if you think about it, if you're trying to show that if a student takes CCCSLC before the male student does that, they will get an above average score, right?
Okay.
So the score will be higher than those students who only take CSET. But to validate that also, someone may ask you, but how does that line up with the female cohort? So to test that, we compare the female cohort and the male cohort. And if that is the case, there should not be any huge differences or what we call statistically significant differences in the average score. They should pretty much be on par. Is
there any data that says that females of that age group is better predisposed in the math field than males of similar age?
There's an argument for that, and there's an argument for and for not. There's a similarity and there's also a difference. Okay. When we get to that, when we get to the learning theory, when we actually draw out from the literature, views on that from the scholars. We call it theoretical framework and the structure that we're using. We develop the system hybridism learning theory. Now, what that does is that it integrates what we call the very basic theories, which is mostly social learning theory and humanism learning theory. Those are the two very popular theories that you use when you think about teaching and learning, right? They're the most popular ones. But with that, something that you also have to include is something called student experience. Regardless of the theories, if your student doesn't have a good experience, they're probably not going to perform well.
Define experience in this regard for me.
So student experience is pretty much defined as how the student interacts with the teacher in the classroom. That's one part. And then you also have how they interact with their parents and guardians and family outside of the classroom, right? Because remember, learning happens in the classroom, but then they also have to come out of the classroom, do homework. They have to have nutrition, meals, encouragement from family. There's a whole set of social variables that contribute to the performance of a student.
Did you have to interview, do a survey of parents of the I don't want to call them test subjects, but of the students?
In this case, I didn't have to, because I redrew on the literature, because the literature is pretty conclusive about the experiences
of existing data and literature.
Yeah.
Okay. All right.
But the system hybridism learning theory, what it does though, is that it integrates all of these elements to bring you to the point of an examination score. So everything that is here contributes to the examination score. So the input is really the student, right? The student is the main variable that goes into this system, right? This learning system in the box that has all of these different elements that they're interacting with. And from that, they get an examination score. Then that examination score comes back through the feedback, what we call the feedback loop, to give you opinions, and they'll tell you about their experiences, etc., which then feeds back into another loop for students that may take another examination. So it's pretty mathematical in terms of the structure. It's a we call a semi-sequential system, right? So everything is linked together and they have these fancy joint probabilities. But for the purposes of this research, and Ken, I didn't go down the line of what we call doing the mathematical proofs for this research, but we use it as a conceptual framework to guide us in the research. But the literature is pretty conclusive about student experience and how students, what causes a student to have a better chance of performing well in mathematics. The literature is here for the audience.
When I'm doing research, and this is for Ken Hackshaw, CRMA for the most part. So any research I'm looking at in the field of risk management, and I'm focusing on the dates now. Anything that's like dated early 2000s, I have a problem with that. Right? So I want to ask if the same obtains for you. So a youth between 14 and 19 in 2002, 2003, I would posit is not the same thinking youth in 2022. Right? Behaviors would have changed, there'll be culture changes, right? So like where you have the research study that was done in 2002, 1991, to live with the 2017 and so. But again, this is just me extrapolating my concerns with dated research, right? Did that occur to you, or did you have to make adjustments for that in any form or fashion, or is it so standardized? Because when you talk about in the Venn diagram there, you have things like cognitive development, behavioral factors, cognitive factors, right?
Mhm.
So,
Yeah.
so did you have to make adjustments for that, or was that on top of mind, or?
What happens in research, especially it depends on the applicability to. If you're doing it for action research, you need to show that things were there before. Some things may have changed, but some things are still constant. So, for example, certain behaviors of humans, the behavior or the observation of the behavior
Right.
may appear to be the same, but that does not necessarily change the neurological structure or the physiological structure of a human. So there's certain constant that will hold. So, but with this type of research, what you do is that you go to see what was there, but then you also go to the newer literature, and then you also have to look at the data set that you are using. So the data set that is being used is from 2018 to 2020. And then, of course, you're gonna be looking at literature that's 3 years old, 4 years old, 5 years old, sometimes even 20 years old. But what we want to do is something called a literature analysis. So if you read literature that was in 2002, right, and then you trace that study and trace the theories in there all the way to 2020, and certain things still hold, then what you show in literature is that there is constant across the board.
Right.
But as something changed, then you highlight that to bring it back into the possibility of solving the problem. So you must do a deep dive to see what's there and then come forward.
Okay.
For this type of research, all research you don't necessarily have to do that. But for this type of research that is heavily based on theoretical structures and theoretical concepts, you would need to do that. But you also need to have modern research too.
Right. So I would even add to that, any research involving external factors that could impact on the end result, behavior, right? That, there's no constant there per se.
There's certain things that will hold, certain things that will not hold. Like certain educational policies that was implemented years ago, you can see why it would need to change because things may need to change, but then you justify it with literature and also the statistics.
When was the last time Caribbean education policies were changed?
Well, change or adjusted because they take them now and then, but a full deep dive educational policy reform has not happened for here I come dated back. It has not happened for a while. And then there's a challenge also there because remember you have territories.
Right.
You have individual governments that will have to also be on board with certain things.
Right, but the folks who are doing these exams, it's Caribbean based, right? And so that applies. Those exams are cross all territories, irrespective of what the policies are internal to those territories.
Yeah, and that's a challenge too.
I find that to be a dichotomy of sorts, but I'll leave it up to the folks like you.
Yeah. So you touch on the learning theories. I'm not going to go through all of them, but there's certain theories that are there that bring out certain focus, like variability and learning of mathematics. There's some interesting results that held from over 10 years now that Black males have a lot more variability in learning mathematics than Caucasians and Asians. They're more varied in terms, so they have a wider variance when it comes to average scores, right? And so if you ask the question for that, and we're going to answer some of those questions as we go along. One of the main things though is the motivation. You have to they require a lot more motivation to actually do the work.
Compared to the females or
compared to females and race also. There's a next argument about neurological structure and biological structure and physiological structures. We actually review that type of literature. So we reviewed a lot of biological literature to see if there's a difference in the neuroprocessing. Interesting enough, there isn't a huge difference. There's not a huge difference. What we found that was different was the actual psychological behaviors, which speaks to things like anxiety, self-efficacy, motivation. There were some differences there. And we're going to get into those as I get to the results. But it was interesting in the research because we had to touch on gender similarities and differences to bring it full circle, right? Yeah. We also look at a very controversial topic, which we call critical race theory. Does race actually play a part? Does belief play a part? Does culture play a part? For me, that was one of the most interesting findings. I knew it did, but to see it explicitly in the literature written, it does play a significant role.
Okay, is it that critical race theory is part of the cognitive dissonance behavioral pattern of the individuals that you were looking at? Because I can see critical race theory as an external factor or component, like how people are perceived and the lessons that they are taught. But how did critical race theory play a part in the determination or the results here?
Right. So there's something called culturally relevant pedagogy. So a lot of our systems that we have accepted was not necessarily honed for our people of our kind. So we adopted a lot of the practices of other cultures. So it was not culturally relevant pedagogy. So that was also a challenge that we saw coming through in the literature. And then the frameworks, what we call the structure, the funding structure, a lot of different frameworks what was set up was not conducive to get the optimal performance out of what we call Black male students. And another thing, critical race theory also ties through things like mentorship. So you see it like a hero. If you see a hero, if you see someone that where you want to be eventually, like a mathematician who's Black or a mathematician who's minority, that is not necessarily promoted a lot in the textbooks. Most of the textbooks are usually written by Caucasians and Asians. So the motivation to even try to be a mathematician or even try to be someone very good in math, we found that came through the literature also in terms of what we call the motivation to actually be someone that requires a high level of training in mathematics. There's a very popular author that writes a lot. His name is Julius Davis. You will see him, his work, that's really his specialization in that area. So he's very popular in terms of those type of writings. So you will realize that this topic is a very modern topic in terms of attaching it to education. So in literature, you actually see is 2019. There's certain areas that will have a very modern literature, and then there's some areas that also have a lot of literature that is historical also that you would have need to review. Again, this is a pretty young topic in terms of supporting Black males in mathematics. It's pretty modern, and they're doing a lot of interviews, a lot of narrative-based studies, a lot of focus group studies now that are coming out. Boyne is a very popular author for this in terms of supportive mechanisms, which link back to policies, mentorship. So it's very interesting to see the literature actually speaks to these kind of issues in terms of social, economic, and matriculation risks. A matter of fact, there's a very interesting study by McGee here that actually look at not males necessarily that are underperforming, but the males who actually are top performers in mathematics. So he was trying to see if they have the same kind of challenges as students who are not as motivated or who don't do as well in terms of mathematics as the other students. And he found that those students also have the same challenge. It is just that they're able to get over those challenges a little quicker because of their natural ability to absorb the information a little quicker than the other average student. So very interested in terms of the literature review, was very interested in there. Yeah. So then we get into the fun part. So this study was actually a statistical justification. So I wasn't required to do interviews, but what I was required to do is to review the literature very closely, right? And do a literature analysis and then tie that to the results to give a better justification of why the educational policies need to be updated.
Would you have preferred doing some interviews, including interviews in your research?
For the purposes of this exercise, no. That would have extremely lengthened the time period in completing the doctorate. But you will see in the future research, that is a recommendation. Of course, the research setting was information from Caribbean Examination Council in terms of their annual reports and their examinations. And then the sample. I'm not going to get into all the technicalities of the sample, but the sample was 4,607 students. By definition of generation of a sample, you technically only needed 384.
Yeah, that's not a sample. There's a country there you actually call there. Yeah.
Right. But you do a bigger sample to pretty much satisfy the mundane person that says, this is so small. You got to do more than 384 to get the results. You first have to have the research questions, right? So the first research question was, can taking the CCSLC examination before CSEC increase the average score of a meal, right? And the increase has to be statistically significant. It just can't be an increase. It has to be a significant increase based on statistical theory. Yeah. So to test those hypotheses, we have a null and an alternative, right? So a null is pretty much that it will not increase, and the alternative is that it will increase. Long and short of the story is that after running this study, it was conclusive that if you do take the CCSLC before, you will have a higher average score, right? So you can let that sink in. Ask me a question or two of how do you even verify that, but that is pretty much what the data gave us. It's conclusive that if you do take the examination, you will have a statistically significantly higher score than the student who does not.
Are you planning to do further research, or is more research needed before this turns into, say, presented as a policy document? If that's the conclusion, and you use 4,000 plus samples, which, pretty huge sample.
Yeah.
Is it conclusive then? Can one draw from this that this is as good as it gets?
Well,
or is more work, is more work needed to flesh out anything so that when this is seen, read, presented, then, the haters will hate, but, the facts are facts. Is this conclusion written in cement?
Well, nothing is written in cement in terms of statistics, but you go from the evidence. So the evidence suggests that if you do take the CCSLC before, the average score will be higher, meaning that those students who take CSEC only, their average score is not as high as those who actually take CCSLC before. So what that speaks to is the facts that is a factual statistical finding. To convince the policymaker and the administrators, that's the reason that the literature review was done, to also show that these other elements in terms of teaching and learning also contribute. So if you bring that argument along that side with the literature and the statistical evidence, it's really for them to make a decision. But you won't be able to say that you don't have enough evidence, because you do have the evidence here, both in the writing, in terms of literature, and also in terms of statistical evidence from the actual student writing the examination.
Okay.
Yeah. And as you remember, I told you that we had to compare also the female cohort with the male. And if it holds true that it brings the student to that point where they're able to perform on average with the cohort that also takes the CSLC before CSEC, you shouldn't have much statistical difference. It means scores should not be that different, because you're trying to show that CSEC alone is underperforming in terms of males, but if they do take CCSLC, at least they're performing on this close to the same bar as the counter, which is the female student who also takes CCSLC. So what we found here was that there was no difference, but it was not statistically significantly different, right? So
is another way of saying that gender was not a is not a factor in the scoring here.
Well, the literature speaks to the fact that the gender does not necessarily affect the processing of the information, but it doesn't conclude that it's not an effect.
Okay.
Understand that? But
yeah,
what we show here though is that if they do take the examination, right, more than likely they will perform on par with those other students, females, who also take the examination. But if they don't, I can tell you that they will underperform compared to those students who do write CCSLC before CSEC. So, I mean, the evidence is there in the literature, in terms of the literature analysis, and also the statistical justification. Quickly to the recommendation, you revise the policies, yeah? But then you focus on the vulnerable groups. So when you write a policy, you can write a policy for the population, which is fine, but you must also account for those groups that have a little more challenge or have a higher risk of not performing well.
If a policy, an education policy was to be rewritten based on the conclusions drawn here.
Mm-hmm.
But the caveat to that is you'll have to consider the disadvantage in writing that policy.
With any policy, there's also exemptions, right? So
Right.
if you have a student who's performing way above average, right, they're exempt from doing CCSLC.
Okay.
But those students who on par are not performing as they should, and you can identify that before.
Because how you'll know who's performing at a certain level than others? What's the criteria in the schools for that?
So all the schools in the Caribbean has to be part of merit. So we know on average how the students perform in a particular school. The policy must ensure that schools support the students in terms of learning.
Find support.
Books, extracurricular activities to bring up their skills, etc. The second recommendation was the fact that when you develop policies, when we say support, we actually mean not only teaching, the actual act of teaching, but things that support teaching and learning. So you may have programs that you may need. You may have a specialist that come in to identify if someone has a learning challenge. So that's what we mean by support.
Okay.
Right? So three, one of the things that we found is that when the family is actually involved in the learning process, like parents or close contact family, students tend to perform better. That's something that came out in your literature. So if you have a family member or family members that support you, make sure you do your homework, make sure that you train your understanding, make sure you go to class. That is what we mean by community support and family and community support. Now, one of the important things that we found in literature also is that when students see someone that they want to be like, we call it, you see a hero, they tend to follow that person's timeline in terms of their development. So if a student can read about this person, see what they did, which school they went to, which events they did, which competitions they were in, which graduate school they went to, who was their supervisor, that tends to make actually a big difference in terms of performance in mathematics. More personal for a student is developing what we call their self-efficacy, right? So their motivation to do the work, their capacity to do the work. So the interesting thing about the CCSLC examination is that it builds your competence and literacy, mathematical competence and literacy. So by doing that, it allows you to generate what we call your efficacy. So you start to think that you have the capacity to actually do the work. So once you have that, that leads to what we call being more motivated. And from that, you get less anxious most of the time when you go to actually do mathematical problems. And with that combination, you tend to perform better. The programs that you develop for mathematical learning and teaching must account for that. So you must have things in there that will build the students' self-efficacy, and which will lead to their motivation, which will eventually lead to them wanting to actually do this subject. The final one, which is, of course, that's always going to be a challenge in terms of policies, how wide we're split in the Caribbean in terms of territorial differences separated by water. But there could be a policy change. The policy change, as I said, with every policy change or every policy, there's always going to be a for and against and a middle ground. But we have it's shown through the statistics, through the results, and through the literature that when you create policies, right, the policies must, in terms of education, it should be linked especially to the most vulnerable group. I'm not saying that you change everything to just support the vulnerable group, but it must account for them. And by changing the policy to make CCSLC mandatory, that is possibly one of the steps in the right direction, because that student wouldn't be disadvantaged by being thrown directly to CSEC, right? They will actually be a build-up. And I will give you an example. Before you take Calculus 2, you're more likely to take Calculus 1.
Right, yeah.
Before you take Calculus 1, you may take pre-calculus, and there's a reason for that.
Yeah.
If I throw you at Calculus 2, I'm literally throwing you to the wolves, because you're not, unless you have a very good support group or a very strong ability to learn what you don't know quickly, we call you're above what we call the average on the S curve, you're going to have a challenge. So if you think about it that way, it makes sense, because then the CCSLC is really something that is prerequisite to CSEC. It's not written as a prerequisite, but it's something that usually comes before you would take the CSEC exam. examination.
Right. With respect to the implementation of the policy, to get to the result that you had, is this a must or is this a maybe or should?
So this is a must because actually in my recommendation, I didn't use conditionals. So you will see within the Caribbean context, change the educational policy. And I said you should or you must. Just change it, because what that does is that it makes it on the books mandatory for those students that are easily identified that are having a challenge. Of course, you have the exemptions. Like for me, for example, I didn't do anything past calculus 2, but I did a master's in electrical engineering that required you to pretty much have all the way through to a level 4 bachelor's degree in mathematics to get through an engineering program. So, but there are exemptions for that, and those exemptions are reviewed carefully, which is fine. But again, when I say the policy change happens, is that you have to account for that vulnerable group, and the vulnerable group is that group that may be silent, who's just there not taking in the information, and then you're trying them to take a more advanced examination, which you're probably not going to do very well on.
The policy change needs to be at the government/territory level, or does it needs to be at the Caribbean Examination Council level?
This company is actually member of CSC. We develop syllabi, or syllabuses, whichever one you want to call it. Right. But we don't develop curriculum. So the challenge with making a policy, taking a policy decision at our end, is going to be a challenge. It's best for it to be at the governmental level.
How could you have a syllabus without input in the curriculum?
Well, we don't tell you how to teach it. So a curriculum tells you how to teach material.
Part of it is what you'll be teaching as well. Yeah.
So the syllabus is the content, right, and the requirements, and the curriculum is the actual action of delivering that content. Okay. So each school, each government has the freedom to develop their own curriculum. Right, which is fine, but they can't necessarily develop the syllabi or the syllabus for that particular subject. They can, as a part of what we call, they may develop a syllabus that is linked directly to the syllabus of CSC. But we're not in the business of
understood. For this to be more efficacious, it would have to be close to a Caribbean policy per se, right?
Yeah.
And if you have to speak to, and you're a mathematician, statistics expert, the probability of that happening is where?
Is that no that we're going through COVID, I think is more realistic.
Or likely than
I would say it's more like a 70% chance now.
Okay,
it will change. Yeah.
Okay.
Because no what's going on is that governments, institutions, companies, they're looking for new ways to get things done better.
Right.
And they're trying to be more efficient, and they're looking at a lot more what we call risk intelligence, as you will know.
So, and hence why we wanted to have you here. This will contribute to enhancing or building out that risk IQ, or the of the new leaders, of the future leaders of the Caribbean, and anything that can do that. Well, CRMA is all for that.
Those are the recommendations, and there's also some recommendations for what we call future research. So for the academic or individuals that are interested in action research, or are interested in carrying this research a little further, right? And one of the things that I have 4 recommendations. You can disaggregate the data. So instead of speaking about region, you can break it down by territory, right? Okay. With that, you can isolate not just the average score, because remember the average score is not necessarily it's a central tendency measure, right. But you can break it down by cohorts or what we call quartiles to see how the 75th percentiles perform, how the 50th percentile perform, how the 25th percentile perform, to see if you can draw any nuances there. But also remove the age restriction from 14 to 19, and then look at those individuals that are older than 19. There may be some interesting things there also.
Why did you start at 14 and not from, say, when they get into secondary?
Most students write the CCSLC at around 14.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay.
But you can also compare those students who wrote the CCSLC with those students who are older than 19 that did not write the CCSLC.
Yeah.
Right. That will bring another twist to the results to see what's going on there. And in terms of addressing what they call the qualitative part of the research, you should really develop an instrument, a survey instrument, to get some answers about self-efficacy, motivation, self-concept, anxiety, how students feel when you're doing a math problem.
Who will be the target audience for the survey? The students themselves?
Yeah, so you would get the answers from the students themselves.
Okay.
So that would require, since you're dealing with students, it's going to be require parental consent, IRB approval, government approval also. So
Okay.
that study is going to take a little longer for sure. But it is a recommendation that I will suggest to actually get the answers from the student themselves to see what's going on there.
I just had an epiphany here. What about those with learning disabilities? Do you just totally forget them with respect to this to the subject matter we are discussing now, or those without the learning disabilities but with a disrupted home life and they have to go, stay in one of these homes?
Yeah.
How do you bridge those gaps?
So that's all part of the policy. So as I said, when you develop a policy, it looks at the most vulnerable group. So that group is considered vulnerable.
Yeah.
So you have to think about how you're going to accommodate for that group, right? So that's why, especially educational policy, as I would say, you have to look at that because everyone isn't painted with the same brush necessarily. So you have to be able to have a middle ground. We call it a balanced policy. There's some policies that are unbalanced for certain reasons, but education tends to be a little more balanced in terms of the balance between social, economic, cost-benefit analysis. So there's a lot more that goes into I find educational policies because they're not as simple as a lot of other policies may be. So when I mention the vulnerable groups are not only students who have a challenge learning mathematics. There may be other groups who may not have the exposure or may not be able to meet the requirements. So you have to look at the policy to see, how are we going to get them to this level to actually write CCSLC probably before they can write CSEC. All those things come into play when you do this. And that's why it's important to actually get the answers from the student.
That survey is kind of critical because I would imagine the kids that are in these homes also take these CSEC examinations.
Yeah.
If these policies aren't changed as recommended, what is the risk, or what are the risks? What are we looking at by way of our future, our young leaders? What could potentially can go wrong? That's the question.
You have not a very tame social structure in terms of culture. Then you may have an economic issue also because the ability to earn is based on the ability to have skills and to use those skills to earn. So that's why I also included social and economic risk in this presentation because it actually creates a social and economic risk if you don't allow people to matriculate, not necessarily only to universities, but matriculate to something that can have them earn or develop something with their life.
If we put it at the country level, that could then further reduce the Caribbean's competitive advantage or any particular territory, because part of our competitive advantage is the development of the workforce and So
it has, as I said, it has an economic. So when you say economic, we speak about labor also, So labor economics, organizational economics, So if you don't necessarily implement the policy at the government level, the school actually has the ability to create a program where these students will have to take CCSLC. So it can happen at school level also.
Is there a relationship between crime or the rates of crime and the rates of failure in mathematics?
The literature actually speaks to that. It doesn't necessarily identify mathematics only. It really identifies the certificate, what we call school leaver certificate, or having enough skills to even earn. So not having those skills to earn, you'll turn to deviance and crime. But we can isolate it to see if mathematics contribute to your critical or reasoning thinking skills in terms of decision making, right? That would be interesting.
If the social learning theory in your Venn diagram speaks to environmental factors, which will vary across territories, behavioral factors, which will vary across territories, cognitive factors may be less so. Have you, or do you, by way of further research, have to dissect or get a little bit more granular on a per territory basis?
Well, you can, as
will there be a need for that? Because you know behaviors in Barbados versus Trinidad or in Grenada versus Jamaica, youths, given what they're exposed to, there may be some differences.
There will be differences. There will be differences because once you have a difference in culture, you're going to have a difference in these elements. Because, for example, like humanism learning theory. Humanism learning theory is based on your general philosophy, the cognitive development, the effectiveness, and the psychomotor, right?
Right.
Remember, on the general philosophy, you have belief, religion, culture.
Right.
So that variable will have a significant difference across, more than likely across different territories, right? When it comes to the environmental factors, it's the same thing, because obviously students learn in different environments depending on the culture. You may have a home that have 7 individuals. You may have an extremely large home that have 12 individuals. And then you may have a smaller home that have only 3 individuals. So it has a lot to do with, there's some nuances there for sure that will show up if you do a survey to get those answers. But the thing is that for each territory, even on the regional level, you have to, after you get those results in terms of the questions that you will answer are linked back to these sets and subsets, you would then have to test for significance, which variables are significant variables at that point. And then once you have that, you can then start to correlate that with these scores. And that will tell you which variables influence the scores a lot more than others.
Right. Okay. Thank you for this, for taking the time. We'll definitely be following, especially when it comes to getting these policies effectuated. And I don't know if you have a plan for that. If you're going to do a concept note to the the CARICOM or to independent agencies, independent governments, I don't know, but I'm sure, knowing you as I do, you are already thought that through. So whenever you have that, you're ready to share, we'll invite you and we could have that conversation.
Yeah, no problem at all. Thanks again for having me.
Thank you.